I was just about to switch off the desk lamp when I heard the mailbox clank. No one in their right mind delivers letters at midnight, at least not in this century. For a second, I thought it might be some kid pulling a prank, but when I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air bit at my cheeks, and there it was, a single thick envelope lying neatly in the metal slot like it had been placed, not shoved. The paper was yellowed, the edges curling in a way that said it had been hiding in someone's drawer for years. The postmark stopped me cold, Bar Harbor, Maine, and the date was 5 years after the official disappearance of the Whitmore family. I didn't have to check my files to know that was impossible. The Whitmores weren't just rich, they were the Whitmores. Their name was on hospitals, research labs, and scholarships. Their photographs used to grace the social pages, their philanthropy, always paired with diamond necklaces and champagne toasts. Then one summer evening in 2002, they were gone. All 6 of them, Charles and Margaret Whitmore, their 3 children, and Margaret's elderly mother. The police report boiled down to one conclusion: presumed dead. Rumors swirled about a boating accident, a fire, even foul play, but nothing was ever proven. And now, here was a letter, written in a hand I recognized from old family holiday cards, Margaret Whitmore's. I sat at my desk and slid it open with the silver opener I keep for bills that don't deserve this kind of ceremony. The smell hit me first. Salt, faintly metallic, like sea air trapped in an attic box. The handwriting was neat but jittery, as if the pen had been gripped too tight. If you're reading this, then you found me too soon. We were never lost, only moved. Charles thought it was the only way. The tide comes for us again soon. Don't look for the caves. No signature. No explanation. Just that. I leaned back, staring at the words until they blurred. The postmark said Bar Harbor, and my mind immediately replayed a decade-old detail I'd almost forgotten. In the early weeks of the investigation, a fisherman had claimed to see strange lights near the tide caves along the coast. At the time, the police wrote it off as nonsense from a man with too much whiskey in his bloodstream. But Margaret's warning, "Don't look for the caves," was exactly the kind of thing that makes me look harder. I dug through my old files, dust drifting into the lamplight like lazy snowflakes. There was the black and white family portrait from the 90s, Charles with his strong jaw and tired eyes, Margaret in her perfect pearls, the kids all variations of bright smiles and restless energy. In the corner of one file, I found an article clipped from the Newport Daily News. It was about their last public appearance, a fundraiser at the mansion for the Whitmore Children's Hospital. An evening of elegance, the headline promised. But in the photograph, Charles's smile didn't reach his eyes, and Margaret's hand gripped the stem of her champagne glass like she was bracing for bad news. The official police theory had been boating accident. The family loved sailing, and the weather had been stormy that week. But no wreckage was ever found, and the Coast Guard eventually admitted off-record that the tides that day would have swept any debris to shore. In other words, there should have been something. Instead, the case had faded into polite silence. Their estate was locked up, their fortune transferred into a trust, and their names slowly shifted from dinner party gossip to small-town legend. I turned the letter over, looking for hidden impressions in the paper. Nothing, except, faintly, a number. 4719. A date? A code? I've been at this long enough to know that my curiosity isn't healthy, but it's stubborn. If you've ever felt a hook in your brain pulling you towards something you're not sure you want to see, you'll understand. That night I decided 2 things. I was going to Bar Harbor, and I was going to find those caves. I didn't sleep. Instead, I researched ferry schedules, weather patterns, and tide charts. The letter had stirred something I hadn't felt since my first cold case, a mix of dread and thrill, the feeling that I was standing at the top of a staircase and couldn't see the bottom. Before dawn, I packed my recorder, my camera, and a waterproof flashlight. Bar Harbor was a 6-hour drive from my place in Providence, and the closer I got, the more the sky seemed to close in. Thick gray clouds hung low over the coast, the kind that make the ocean look like molten lead. The smell of salt water hit me before I even saw the shoreline. The town itself was postcard pretty, but it had that off-season emptiness, the kind where the streets feel wider because there's no one to fill them. The few people I passed kept their heads down. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was me. I booked a room at a bed and breakfast with floral wallpaper and a receptionist who looked at my out-of-state ID a beat too long. When I asked about the tide caves, she froze just slightly before shaking her head. "Dangerous this time of year," she said, in the tone people use when they want you to drop a subject. Of course, that only made me want to press harder. That night, I sat by the window, listening to the distant crash of waves. I thought about Margaret's letter, how it had traveled for over a decade before finding me, and I couldn't shake one question. If she was warning me away, who was she afraid would find her? The sea answered with a low, endless roar, and in the dark reflection of the glass, my own eyes looked like they belonged to someone who'd already stepped too far in. The Whitmore fundraiser had been the kind of event that small-town society columns lived for. Glittering dresses, candlelit tables, the mayor shaking hands with people who'd never set foot in City Hall unless it was for a photo op. The night they all vanished was supposed to be a celebration, the 10th anniversary of the Whitmore Children's Hospital in Providence, one of the family's crown jewels. But in the weeks after, when I pored over old interviews and security footage, I began to see something very different. I'd gotten my hands on the full guest list once, 206 names, nearly all prominent either in medicine, finance, or old Rhode Island money. Everyone remembered the grandeur. No one remembered the tension. Not until I started calling them. The first person willing to talk was a retired pediatric surgeon named Dr. Edwin Lane. He'd been at the hospital's opening ceremony years earlier, back when Charles Whitmore was still hailed as a visionary. On the phone, Lane's voice was slow, deliberate. It wasn't a normal party, he told me. Margaret barely touched her food. Charles disappeared for nearly 40 minutes, came back pale as a sheet. And the champagne? No one drank it. Not a drop. The waiters poured it down the drains after. I found that last part interesting, especially when I tracked down one of those waiters. He confirmed it, but added a detail Lane hadn't mentioned. We were told to keep refilling the glasses, but not to let anyone actually drink. When I asked why, the head butler said, "It's symbolic." Symbolic of what? The estate itself was a Gothic revival mansion on the outskirts of Newport, a short drive from the marina where their yacht was docked. I'd been there once, years ago, when the grounds were still open for charity tours. The conservatory, the ballroom, the ridiculous mahogany library. It was the sort of place designed to impress. But it was the smaller details that stayed with me. An unlit hallway leading to a locked door, the faint smell of iodine in a room that should have smelled of polish and wood. In the police timeline, the Whitmores left the gala around 11:15 p.m. Their car was seen on security cameras heading toward the marina. After that, nothing. No departure records, no sightings. The boat never arrived anywhere, and no bodies were ever found. That's the story the public knew. But I'd spoken to a patrol officer who'd been fresh out of the academy at the time. He claimed that hours after the official search began, a local fisherman reported seeing a small skiff, not the Whitmores' yacht, heading out toward the tide caves. The officer had been told to log it as irrelevant. Margaret's letter suddenly felt heavier in my bag. The next morning in Bar Harbor, I decided to retrace the night from the family's perspective. I started with the marina, though all I found now were rows of weathered fishing boats, rocking against the docks. The Whitmore's yacht had long since been sold, its name repainted. Still, I stood at the end of the pier and tried to imagine the feel of that July night, humid with the sharp tang of salt and diesel fuel and the muffled thump of bass from some kid's party across the water. If they hadn't gone sailing, where had they gone? By noon, I was driving south toward Newport. The estate loomed from the road like something out of a Gothic novel, its gray stone walls streaked darker by years of rain. The gates were padlocked, the grounds choked with ivy. I parked along the roadside and walked the perimeter. It was when I reached the back gardens that I noticed it, a narrow gravel path almost swallowed by weeds leading toward the conservatory. The glass panes were fogged with years of grime, but through a gap I could see shapes, tables covered in white cloth, shelves stacked with pottery, and something else. A glint of metal. That was when the rain started. Not a drizzle, one of those sudden Atlantic downpours that soaks you through in minutes. I retreated to the car, but my mind stayed on the conservatory. The last person to see the family alive at the gala had been a local photographer hired to capture candid moments. Her name was Abby Kearns, and she still lived in town. She agreed to meet me at a diner off the main road, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt toast, but the waitresses remember your order after one visit. Abby looked younger than her years, with hair pulled back in a messy bun and a habit of chewing on her straw when she was thinking. "I always thought it was weird," she told me between sips. "Margaret asked me not to take any shots during the last hour of the party, said she didn't want flash to ruin the mood. But people's moods were already ruined. The older boy, Daniel, looked like he'd been crying, and Charles, he was pacing, checking his watch, like he was late for something. I asked if she'd seen them leave. No, but I did see a car, black, no plates, pull up along the east driveway. The family went that way. I thought maybe it was a chauffeur. But later, when I went through the shots I did take, I noticed something. Someone in the background of 3 different photos, always near the Whitmores, but never facing the camera. Tall, wearing a white coat. Not a tuxedo. Not a suit. A white coat. The kind you wear in a lab. I left the diner with the uneasy sense that I was walking into something designed to stay buried. Margaret's words came back to me, quiet but urgent. "Don't look for the caves." Which meant, of course, that I had to. The Whitmore estate had always been the kind of place you couldn't just drop in on. High stone walls, a gate taller than most houses, and a security system that was ahead of its time when it was installed in the late 80s. But in 2025, all of that was just for show. The power was cut, the cameras pointed at nothing, and the iron gate was rusting like an old tomb marker. The conservatory sat at the far end of the back gardens, partially hidden by overgrown hydrangea bushes. In its prime, it had been a glass palace filled with exotic plants, a place where Margaret was photographed more than once hosting ladies' teas for charity. Now it was a greenhouse only in structure. Inside was shadow and stillness, the glass panes smeared with dirt, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth and something sharper, like copper. I'd brought a crowbar. Yes, I know. Subtlety isn't my strong suit, and it took less than a minute to jimmy the rusted latch. The door gave way with a moan that seemed louder than it should have been, the kind of sound that makes you instinctively check over your shoulder. Inside, the light filtered in through grime-streaked glass, turning everything a muted green. The air was thick and stale, and my first step stirred a puff of dust that clung to my throat. Rows of tables stood like patient soldiers, packed, their surfaces covered in empty clay pots, cracked watering cans, and curling leaves long since turned to paper. But there were also additions. In the far corner, half concealed by a leaning shelf, was a wooden crate with a metal latch. It wasn't locked, just latched, and inside were stacks of papers bound with string. I unwrapped the top bundle, yellowed pages filled with neat, slanted handwriting, chemical formulas, dates, notations like trial 3, 41% success, and subject resisted, possible reversion. No signatures, no identifying marks, just the meticulous record-keeping of someone who wasn't planning to explain their work to outsiders. And then there was the bedroll. Tucked against the wall behind a table was a rolled-up sleeping bag, the kind you take camping. Next to it sat a chipped enamel mug with dried coffee residue and a paperback novel swollen from water damage. Whoever had been here hadn't just been storing things, they'd been staying here. The floor beneath the table was dusty, except for one section where the boards were clean, as if something had been moved recently. I crouched, running my hand along the floorboards, and felt it, a subtle shift beneath my fingers. One plank was shorter than the rest. I pried it up. Inside the hollow space was a tin box. It rattled when I picked it up, the sound of metal against metal. The lid came off reluctantly, revealing coins. Not modern ones. Silver dollars, some so worn the faces were ghostly. Beneath them, folded in half, was a Polaroid photo. It showed the Whitmore children, Daniel, Sophie, and little Matthew, standing in front of what looked like the tide caves. But the date printed on the white strip below read 2004, 2 years after the night they supposedly died. I felt my pulse in my ears. That's when I heard the sound. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic. A soft creak followed by the faintest shuffle like someone trying to move quietly over gravel. I froze, every muscle suddenly wired tight, and listened. The noise stopped. For a moment I told myself it could be an animal. Raccoon, maybe? But then I saw it, a shadow sliding across the glass, tall and narrow. Whoever it was paused, then moved away toward the back gardens. I shoved the Polaroid into my bag, relatched the crate, and slipped out the conservatory door. The rain from earlier had left the grass slick, and my shoes made almost no sound as I followed the path the shadow had taken. But by the time I reached the rear perimeter wall, there was nothing. Just the wet hush of leaves and the distant hum of the ocean. Back at my car, I turned the Polaroid over. Written in faint pencil were 3 words: "Don't let go." I stayed in the driver's seat for a while, the letter from Margaret on the passenger side, the Polaroid in my lap. 2 messages, years apart, both cryptic, both warning me off and daring me forward at the same time. Before leaving Newport, I stopped at the public records office. A friend there owed me a favor, and within an hour I had scanned copies of the original police statements from the household staff. All the accounts were strangely bland, as if they'd been written by people determined to remember nothing. Family seemed well, no unusual activity. Guests departed without incident, all except one. The statement from the head gardener mentioned seeing Charles Whitmore in the conservatory the afternoon of the gala. He was moving things into the floor space under the tables, the gardener wrote, and told me not to speak of it to anyone. That was the last entry in the file. I left the records office knowing 2 things for sure. Charles had hidden something in that conservatory, and his children were alive at least 2 years longer than anyone had admitted, and the only way to find out why was to go where Margaret told me not to. The tide caves. The Whitmore staff had always been an institution in themselves, loyal to the family, polished to perfection, and trained to say just enough to be polite while never giving anything away. Even after the disappearance, most of them stayed in Newport, melting into other households or quietly retiring on pensions that I suspected came with certain strings attached. I started with the easiest one to find, Peter Hollis, the former chauffeur. In the police reports, his statement was exactly 3 sentences long, none of them useful. But according to the local white pages, he still lived in a modest colonial-style house on the edge of town. He answered the door in a cardigan, his posture still military straight despite his age. For the first few minutes, he was all manners. Small talk about the weather, offers of coffee. But when I brought up the Whitmores, his gaze shifted, as if measuring how much to say. They were complicated people. He said finally, settling into an armchair. Kind, yes. Generous. But there were rules. Rules you didn't break if you wanted to stay in their good graces. I asked, what kind of rules? No questions about where they went on certain nights, no questions about deliveries from the clinic, and definitely no questions about the basement. That last part caught my attention. The mansion didn't have a basement on the blueprints I'd seen. Peter hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his cardigan. He pulled out a scrap of paper, folded so many times the edges had gone soft. He placed it on the table between us. It was a torn page from a notebook, the paper smudged and brittle. On it was a handwritten list of names, about a dozen in total. Half of them had been crossed out in a heavy black stroke. I recognized some of the names. 2 were members of the household staff who had since passed away. Another belonged to Dr. Farr, Edwin Lane, the retired surgeon I'd spoken to earlier. The uncrossed names were unfamiliar. "What is this?" I asked. Peter's fingers tightened around the armrest. "A list of people who knew," he said quietly. "Knew about the experiments. About the restoration." He wouldn't say more, but when I pressed him about the basement, his eyes darted to the window as if checking for someone outside. "It's not on any plans," he murmured, "but it's there. And it's older than the house." Older than the house, which meant it might not have been built by the Whitmores at all. Before I could ask another question, he stood and walked to the door, signaling the conversation was over. "You should go," he said, his voice low, "and you should burn that letter." I left with the folded page in my pocket and a tight feeling between my shoulder blades, like I'd just painted a target on my back. My next stop was the home of Eleanor Griggs, the former head housekeeper. She was harder to pin down. Her address led me to a senior living complex outside Providence, the kind with manicured lawns and cheerful seasonal wreaths on every door. Eleanor was sharper than Peter, her eyes bright despite her frail frame. When I mentioned the Whitmores, she gave a small, humorless smile. They were always preparing for something, she said, even before the night they left. Charles had deliveries coming at odd hours, crates, medical equipment, and there were rooms in that house we were never to enter, whole wings sometimes. I asked if she'd ever disobeyed. "Once," she said. "The West Wing was closed for weeks. I was sent to fetch linens and took the wrong hallway. I saw Dr. Whitmore, Charles, standing over a metal table. There was a woman on it. She was breathing, but her eyes were open like she was staring at something far away. He told me to leave, and I never went back." That was enough to make me sit forward. "Do you know who she was?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not a guest, not family. And when I asked the kitchen staff about her, they said no one was there. But I know what I saw." When I mentioned the caves, Eleanor's smile faded. "We knew about them," she admitted. "Old smugglers' tunnels. They run under the cliffs from the shoreline all the way inland. The family kept a key to a locked gate down there, said it was for safety in storms." But from the look in her eyes, I could tell she didn't believe that. By the time I left, I had a handful of puzzle pieces. A hidden basement older than the mansion, a list of names tied to something called the Restoration, a woman on a table who wasn't supposed to exist, and tunnels that connected the estate to the sea caves. The picture they made wasn't clear yet, but it was enough to tell me that whatever happened to the Whitmores wasn't an accident, and it didn't end the night they vanished. Back in my car, I unfolded the list again. At the bottom, in the same handwriting, was a small notation, BH May 14th. Bar Harbor. The tide chart I'd printed before the trip was still in my glove compartment. On May 14th, the tide would be at its highest just after midnight. I didn't need to guess where I'd be that night. The hospital ledger was tucked away in the county archives, in one of those beige metal filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. It was the kind of discovery you almost trip over, a misfiled box shoved behind a stack of tax records from the 70s. I'd gone looking for construction permits, hoping to verify Peter's claim about a basement that wasn't on the blueprints. What I found instead was a thick, leather-bound book with Providence Private Medical Registry stamped across the front. No lock, just a tarnished brass clasp. The first half of the ledger looked normal enough. Patient admissions, treatment notes, billing codes. But halfway through, the entries changed. No last names, no billing, just a string of first names and dates, with the occasional note in a precise, almost obsessive hand. Transition successful. Subject resistant, awaiting tide. Every date was within a 3-year span leading up to the Whitmores' disappearance. And then there were the addresses. Not hospital wards, not home visits. Each one was marked the same way. BH. Bar Harbor. At the very bottom of one page, I found a name I recognized. Daniel. No last name, no age, but the date next to it was 2 months after the family vanished. The note beside it read, "No deterioration observed. Proceed with full restoration at next cycle." I was still staring at those words when I heard a cough behind me. A man in his 60s, wearing the kind of cheap suit you only see in public offices, was standing in the doorway. "Those files aren't supposed to be out," he said, his tone somewhere between bored and suspicious. I snapped the ledger shut. "They were misfiled," I said, which was technically true. He watched me too long before stepping aside. "Don't get lost down here. The lights have a mind of their own." That night, in my motel room, I laid the ledger out on the bed next to Margaret's letter and the Polaroid from the conservatory. The picture, the warning, and now the medical record. They were all pointing in the same direction. Whatever the restoration was, it had been happening in Bar Harbor, and the Whitmores had been at the center of it. The next morning, I drove north. Bar Harbor looked different in daylight. The clapboard storefronts and bright awnings gave it a postcard charm, but it was a town that carried its history like a bruise. The locals were polite, but there was a stiffness in the way they spoke, like every conversation was a test. I started at the docks. Fishermen were unloading the morning's catch, the air thick with salt and diesel. I asked about the tide caves, casually at first, then more directly. Most shrugged, said they were dangerous. A few just walked away mid-sentence. It wasn't until I found an older man mending nets on the far pier that I got something more. His hands were rough, his eyes sharp under the bill of his cap. When I mentioned the Whitmores, he paused just long enough for me to notice. "They came here once," he said finally. "Not all of them, just the man and the boy. Went out past the point. Tide was high that day." I asked what they were doing. He shrugged. "Not my business, but they weren't the only ones. Had doctors coming up from Boston, always in pairs, always carrying cases. One of them told me they were visiting the clinic. We don't have a clinic." When I pressed about the caves, his mouth tightened. "Stay on the main road, stranger. That's the only advice you'll get from me." Then he picked up his nets and walked off. By late afternoon, I'd made my way to the edge of town where the coastline turned jagged. From there, you could see the dark mouths of the tide caves, half submerged, waiting for the sea to decide when they'd open again. I stood on the rocks, the wind tearing at my jacket, and thought about the note in the ledger. A waiting tide. If I wanted to know what had happened to the Whitmores, I'd have to wait for it too. And something told me I wasn't the only one planning to be there when the water went out. The tide calendar said low water would hit at 4:12 a.m., which meant I had a long, sleepless night ahead of me. I holed up in a cheap waterfront inn whose walls were so thin I could hear the couple in the next room debating whether clam chowder counted as breakfast. Outside, the wind rattled the old sash windows, and every now and then I caught the muffled horn of a ship moving through the harbor. Around 2 a.m., I packed a flashlight, the waterproof recorder I'd borrowed from the Historical Society, and a coil of rope that still smelled faintly of diesel from the docks. The town was silent when I stepped out. Even the gulls seemed to have called it a night. I followed the narrow road out toward the cliffs, my boots crunching over gravel, breath ghosting in the cold air. By the time I reached the overlook, the moon had dipped behind a bank of clouds, and the ocean below was an unbroken sheet of black. As the tide drained away, the caves began to take shape, jagged entrances carved into the rock, yawning wider with every minute. The smell hit me first. Wet stone, rotting kelp, and something metallic, like rusted iron. I climbed down the slick path toward the largest opening, my flashlight beam catching on barnacles and seaweed. Inside, the ceiling was low enough that I had to hunch, and the water still lapped at my ankles. The sound echoed strangely. Every drip and splash amplified until it felt like someone was following just a few paces behind. About 50 feet in, the passage widened into a chamber. That's when I saw it. A set of iron gurneys, stacked against the wall like discarded furniture. Rust covered most of the frames, but the leather straps were still intact. Nearby, half buried in sand, was a crate stenciled with faded lettering, "Property of Providence Medical Research." I knelt to brush away the grit, and something small and hard rolled out, a brass key tag. The number 7 was etched into its surface, and on the back, a single word, restoration. I barely had time to process it before my flashlight flickered. At first, I thought it was just the damp messing with the batteries, but then I heard it, a faint metallic rattle, like chain links shifting in the dark. I froze. The sound was coming from deeper inside the cave, past where the beam of my light could reach. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was dragging something heavy over stone. I should have turned and run, but curiosity has always been my worst vice. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and took 3 steps forward. That's when a figure appeared in the gloom. They were tall, wearing a long oilskin coat, hood drawn low. I couldn't see their face, but their gloved hands were wrapped around the handle of a metal cart. On it was a sealed cylindrical container about the size of a coffin. The figure didn't move toward me, didn't speak, just stood there, the sound of the tide echoing faintly behind us. Then they tilted their head as if sizing me up, and without a word pushed the cart into a narrow side tunnel I hadn't noticed before. The darkness swallowed them whole. I followed for maybe 10 paces before the water surged in, a sudden, icy rush that soaked me to the knees. In seconds, the side tunnel was impassable, the current roaring through it like a freight train. I staggered back toward the entrance, heart hammering. By the time I reached open air, the tide had already begun its slow return. On the path above, a single set of wet footprints led away from the cliffs. They weren't mine. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spread the key tag, Margaret's letter, and the ledger across my bed, the number 7. Restoration. A cart in the caves. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just history, it was still going on, and now someone knew I'd seen it. By sunrise, the town felt like a different planet. The wind had died, the harbor glittered under a pale wash of gold, and the air carried the clean scent of salt and fresh bread from the bakery 2 doors down. You'd never guess that a few hours earlier I'd been standing knee-deep in freezing water, staring at a hooded figure pushing a coffin-sized container into a flooded tunnel. But the footprints, those, still haunted me. I spent the morning trailing them in my mind, trying to picture where they'd led. The path from the cliffs eventually bled into an overgrown trail behind the abandoned Harrow estate. The place had been empty for decades. A sprawling Victorian house with a widow's walk, shuttered windows, and a gate chained shut so long the metal was fused with rust. The Harrows were one of those New England dynasties, bankers, politicians, a judge or two, who'd once owned half the county. The last known heir, a woman named Constance, had vanished in 1973. No body, no note. The rumors? Everything from a secret lover in Europe to being kidnapped by her own relatives. I'd always filed it under local legend, but now I wasn't so sure. The chain around the gate was gone. In its place, the latch hung open like a jaw unhinged. I told myself I was just looking for a vantage point, just to see if there was any sign of the hooded stranger. But the second I stepped onto the gravel drive, I felt it. That prickling between the shoulder blades. The sense of being seen before you've even earned it. The front door was locked, but one of the side windows on the first floor had a pane missing. I slid my arm through, found the latch, and pushed it open with a creak that could have woken the dead. The air inside was thick, dust and mold, overlaid with something faintly chemical, like antiseptic. My boots sank into carpet gone soft with rot. Room after room looked frozen in time. Heavy drapes, sheet-covered furniture, portraits of stern-faced ancestors glaring down from the walls. In the library, I found a fireplace still stacked with ash that didn't look decades old. Whoever had been here, they'd been here recently. Then I found the study. The desk was littered with papers, some so brittle they crumbled at my touch, but tucked in the center drawer was a single sheet that looked brand new. Thick cream paper, embossed with the same insignia from the ledger, the serpent and staff coiled around a capital M. Beneath it, a short typed message: Phase 7 is ready for transfer. Restoration begins at the new moon. That word again. Restoration and Phase 7. My mind snapped straight to the brass key tag I'd found in the caves. I was so caught up staring at the letter that I almost missed the sound. A slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. I froze, head tilted, every nerve on alert. Another step. Then another. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I shoved the letter into my coat and moved fast, ducking through the nearest doorway into what had once been a music room. The grand piano was missing its lid, strings rusted and slack, but it was big enough to crouch behind. The footsteps descended the stairs. From my hiding spot, I could see into the hall. A shadow stretched long against the faded wallpaper, tall, with a long coat, just like the figure in the cave. They stopped halfway to the door, head turning as if listening. I held my breath. Then, without warning, they stepped into the library. A chance. I bolted for the side window I'd come through, glass rattling as I shoved it open and dove out. I didn't look back until I'd reached the street. The Harrow estate loomed behind me, silent as stone, no movement in the windows. But the whole way back to the inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that the footsteps I heard weren't just my own. That night, sleep was an uninvited guest who decided not to show up. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow stretching across the Harrow estate hallway, heard the measured creak of those footsteps. It wasn't just fear. It was the bone-deep certainty that whoever they were, they knew exactly who I was now. The letter burned in my pocket like a guilty secret. Phase 7. Restoration. New moon. I checked the calendar. The new moon was in 3 nights, which meant whatever this was, it was coming fast. The next morning, I walked down to the harbor for air, but the town had shifted again. It wasn't just my imagination. People I'd nodded to before avoided eye contact. Conversations died when I passed. The fishermen at the pier leaned close, speaking in low voices I couldn't quite catch. Something about Harrow Point was curling in on itself, like the place was holding its breath. I headed straight for the county archives, a squat brick building that smelled like paper and cold coffee. The clerk was a wiry man with a voice so soft it made you lean in to hear. He didn't seem thrilled to see me, but when I said I was researching the Harrow family, he shrugged and led me to a set of metal filing drawers that squealed like they hadn't been touched in years. The Harrow's history was exactly what you'd expect: banking fortune, political ties, land deals. But it was the 1960s and 70s that caught my eye. A sharp drop in public appearances, charity events canceled, 2 sudden deaths within the family, both labeled heart failure in people who weren't even 50. And then, in 1973, the disappearance of Constance Harrow, last seen attending a closed-door restoration ceremony at the family chapel on the estate grounds. I asked the clerk if there were any photographs of this chapel. He shook his head slowly. No photographs allowed. They said it was sacred. Sacred. Or secret. Before I could press further, his eyes shifted to the glass door at the front of the archives. A man in a long coat stood outside just far enough that I couldn't make out his face. The clerk's jaw tightened. "I think you'd better go," he said quietly. The figure didn't follow me when I left, but I could feel his presence trailing like a shadow all the way back to my room. By late afternoon, the rain started again, light, steady, drumming against the roof of the inn. I sat at the desk, letter in front of me, brass key tag beside it. The more I stared at the serpent and staff emblem, the more I was convinced it wasn't just decorative. The serpent wasn't wrapped randomly. It was coiled in exactly 7 loops. Phase 7. I decided to take the risk. After dark, I headed back to the Harrow estate. This time, I didn't go through the front gate. I skirted around the side, through the trees, until I reached what must have been the family chapel. It was smaller than I'd imagined, white clapboard, a steeple barely high enough to be seen from the road. The door was locked, but the key tag in my pocket felt like a dare. I fit the key into the lock. It turned smoothly. Inside, the air was different, cold but not from the weather. The pews were gone, replaced by rows of covered tables. The covers weren't cloth, they were thick, dark plastic, and underneath, the shapes weren't right for anything you'd want in a chapel. At the front, where the altar should have been, stood a glass case. Inside was something that froze me in place. A mannequin, or so I thought, dressed in a faded 19th century gown. But the skin, visible at the neck and hands, had the pale, waxy look of something preserved. The face was that of a woman in her 30s, eyes closed, mouth set in a faint smile. And on the base of the case, Constance Harrow. There was no sound except the rain and my own breathing, which suddenly felt too loud. Then I heard it, the creak of the chapel door closing. I wasn't alone. The door's click was soft, but in the heavy stillness of the chapel, it sounded like the snap of a trap. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the glass case, though my peripheral vision strained to catch a silhouette behind me. Constance was the first, a man's voice said quietly, steady, unhurried, almost conversational, but not the last. I turned. He was tall, the kind of tall that made you straighten your back without realizing it. The long coat I'd seen from the archives clung to him, damp from rain. His hair was silver at the temples, though his face didn't match the age. It was unlined, almost unnaturally so. In his gloved hand he held a small brass lantern, the light painting sharp shadows up the chapel walls. I stepped back instinctively, my heel hitting one of the covered tables. The shape beneath the plastic shifted. "I was told you'd come here eventually," he said, walking toward me with deliberate slowness. "Your curiosity has been noted." My brain scrambled for a way out, but the only exit was behind him, and something in his calm demeanor told me running wouldn't end well. "What happened to her?" I asked, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "She was chosen," he said, as if that explained everything. The family's blood had thinned. The rites demanded restoration. The word restoration flashed in my mind with the letter in my pocket. Phase 7. I glanced toward the glass case. "That's not restoration," I said. "That's preservation," he finished for me. "Until the time is right, until the circle closes." He took another step forward, the lantern's glow catching on the serpent emblem stitched into his coat cuff. 7 loops, just like the key tag. "You've seen enough," he said, and his tone was still polite, still measured, but it held finality like a door closing. He reached into his coat, and for one heart-jolting moment, I thought I'd see a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it out. I didn't take it right away. "This," he said, "is your invitation. The new moon is in 2 nights. Attendance is not optional." I took it because not taking it felt more dangerous. The paper was heavy, almost like parchment. On the front, my name was written in the same looping hand as the original letter. Inside, only a date, time, and location. Harrow Chapel, midnight. When I looked up, he was already at the door. "Don't be late," he said without turning back. The door swung shut behind him, and the faint crunch of gravel faded into the rain. I exhaled, the sound shaky in the cold air. My fingers tightened around the invitation. I should have left right then, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the gnawing thought that I'd just been handed an opening into whatever this was, a front row seat. I pulled back the plastic on the nearest table. It wasn't a mannequin. It wasn't anything I wanted to see. A man lay beneath, dressed in ceremonial white, skin pale and dry like paper. His hands were folded over his chest, and in them was clutched the same brass serpent emblem. His eyes were sewn shut. I staggered back, pulling the plastic over him again. Every table in here was the same. When I finally left the chapel, the night air hit me like a slap. My mind was a mess of questions, but one thing was certain. 2 nights from now, I'd be back here. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to know how deep this went. On the walk back to the inn, the rain eased into a mist. Somewhere behind me on the slick road, I heard another pair of footsteps matching my pace. I didn't look back. 2 nights later, I found myself back at the chapel, though chapel felt like too small a word for what it had become. From the outside, it looked unchanged. Dark stone, weathered windows, rainwater streaming down the edges of the roof. But a faint, warm light pulsed behind the stained glass, and the low murmur of voices leaked into the night. I stood in the shadows beneath the old yew trees, invitation clutched in my palm. It had felt heavier in my pocket all day, as if it knew where it was going. A procession of black-clad figures filed toward the side entrance, each carrying the same brass lantern I'd seen in the man's hand. No one spoke. They simply moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like part of a single body. I followed, staying far enough back that I was just another shadow in the mist. Inside the chapel was transformed. The pews were gone, replaced by concentric circles of chairs around a raised platform in the center. Heavy crimson drapes covered the walls, swallowing any sound. The air was thick with incense, sweet and cloying, masking the damp stone smell I remembered from before. On the platform lay one of the white-draped tables, the same kind I'd seen 2 nights earlier, only this time the figure on it was breathing. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, a white veil covering her face. At her feet stood the silver-haired man, coat gone, replaced by ceremonial robes threaded with gold. Around his neck hung a pendant shaped like the serpent emblem, the 7 coils glinting in the lantern light. The circles of chairs filled quickly. I lingered at the back, half hidden behind one of the crimson drapes, watching. When the murmuring stopped, he began to speak. His voice was the same as before, steady, measured, but now it carried a weight, an almost hypnotic cadence. "We gather," he said, "as those before us have gathered for 7 generations. The bloodline renews, the circle holds." The congregation responded in unison, a low chant in a language I didn't recognize. He gestured toward the veiled woman. "Tonight, the vessel receives the mark." I craned my neck to see. One of the robed attendants stepped forward, holding a small silver blade. They pulled back the woman's sleeve, revealing pale skin. I felt my pulse in my throat. The serpent emblem wasn't just a symbol. It was about to be cut into her flesh. Every instinct told me to leave, to walk out into the night and never look back. But my feet stayed rooted, as if the incense itself was weighing me down. The blade touched her skin, and she flinched. It wasn't the reaction of someone willing, it was a reflex of fear. Something inside me snapped. I moved before I thought it through, slipping from behind the drape and into the nearest circle. Heads turned, murmurs rippled. The silver-haired man's eyes found mine instantly, calm but sharp. "You're early," he said. "I'm leaving," I shot back, voice steadier than I felt. "And she's coming with me." The air seemed to tighten, the incense suddenly choking. No one moved until 2 attendants stepped into my path. Their hands were gloved, but I could see the faint outline of something hard beneath the fabric. The man on the platform didn't raise his voice. "You've already been chosen," he said. "To leave now would be to break the circle, and we do not break the circle." Behind him, the woman's breathing quickened. My eyes locked on her, and in that moment, I made my choice. I lunged for the platform. The first attendant grabbed my arm, but I twisted free, adrenaline overriding the ache in my shoulder. I reached for the woman, pulling the veil away. It wasn't Constance. It was someone else entirely. Young, terrified, her lips trembling as she mouthed something I couldn't hear. Hands closed on my jacket, dragging me backward. The silver-haired man stepped closer, the gold thread in his robes catching the light like flame. "You're not ready," he said softly, "but you will be." Something sharp pressed into my neck. The world tilted, and the crimson drapes swam into darkness. The last thing I felt was the cold touch of a gloved hand on my cheek. I woke up in a place that smelled like wet concrete and old wood. The ceiling above me was low, lined with exposed beams. The light came from a single bulb swinging gently overhead. its pull chain tapping softly against the glass every time it swayed. My head throbbed in rhythm with it, a dull pulse behind my eyes. When I tried to sit up, I realized my hands were bound, not with rope, but with some kind of soft cloth. It wasn't tight enough to hurt, but it was enough to make my wrists ache. My ankles were free, though, and that was something. A metal door stood at the far end of the room, its paint peeling in long curls. To the left, a narrow table sat under the bulb, covered in objects, a notebook, a brass lantern like the others, and what looked like a row of old family photographs. I shuffled closer, the bindings pulling awkwardly against my skin. The photos were all black and white, some faded to sepia. They showed groups of well-dressed people, men in dark suits, women in elaborate gowns, standing in front of the same chapel I'd just been inside. But it was the faces that stopped me. In each photo, there was always one person in the center. Male or female, young or middle-aged, it didn't matter. Their eyes were darker, their expressions sharper, like they knew something the rest didn't. And in more than one, I thought I recognized the silver-haired man, though the pictures had to be decades old. The notebook was leather-bound, the pages brittle. The handwriting was neat but slanted, with entire sections in that same unrecognizable language they'd chanted earlier. I flipped forward, scanning for anything in English. Near the middle, I found it. The vessel is marked. The blood is joined. The serpent wakes. 7 generations hold the circle until the return. It was dated exactly 50 years ago. Before I could turn the page, the door opened. The silver-haired man stepped in, carrying 2 steaming cups. "Drink," he said, setting one on the table near me. I didn't move. "You'll need your strength," he continued, his voice calm but steady. "Tonight, you leave the shadows." "I'm not staying," I said. He smiled, not warmly but knowingly. "You've already stayed longer than most." I glanced at the cup. The steam smelled faintly of herbs, sweet but with a bitter undercurrent. "What happened to the woman on the table?" I asked. "She has been prepared," he said. "As you will be. The vessel must be chosen by the bloodline, and yours runs deeper than you think." It sounded like nonsense, but something in his tone made my stomach knot. "I'm not part of your family." His smile faded. "You should ask your mother about that, if you ever see her again." The way he said it made me realize they had looked into me, my family, my past, and now they were sure of something I wasn't. I tried to keep my voice level. "Why me?" He picked up one of the photos, the edges curling under his fingers. "Because the circle has a place for you, and because breaking it would be dangerous." He slid the cup closer. "Drink, or I'll have them bring you something less pleasant." The bulb swung slightly, casting shadows across his face. I weighed my options. Drinking might dull my senses, or it might be the only way to buy time. I lifted the cup and pretended to sip, letting the liquid touch my lips but not swallow. His eyes stayed on me, searching for hesitation. I forced myself to meet his gaze. When he finally stepped back, I knew I had maybe minutes before someone else came in. My wrists were still bound, but the knot was loose enough that I might work it free if I kept moving. And if I could get out that door, maybe, just maybe, I'd find Constance. But then I saw it. On the wall by the door, half hidden by the shadow of the swinging bulb, was a painting. It showed the chapel, the serpent emblem coiled above it, and standing at the chapel's entrance was a man who looked exactly like my father. My breath caught, the sound loud in the stale, dusty air. I blinked hard, half expecting the image to change, half hoping I'd imagined it. But the figure in the painting stayed exactly the same. The face was unmistakable. My father, wearing a dark, old-fashioned suit, standing stiffly with his hands clasped in front of him. The painting's muted colors couldn't quite hide the intensity in his eyes, but that was impossible. My father died when I was 12, and that was barely over a decade ago. This portrait looked like it belonged to a time 50 years past. I took a shaky step toward it. The paint had cracked in places, giving his face a strange, fractured texture. Beneath the brushstrokes, I could almost see a shadow, like another figure had once been painted over. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" a voice said behind me. I turned sharply. A woman stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing the same ceremonial robes as the others, just a long, dark coat buttoned all the way to her neck. Her black hair was pinned neatly back, and her eyes held a calm I didn't trust. "Who are you?" I asked. "Someone who knows more about you than you'd like." She stepped into the room, the soles of her shoes making no sound on the cement floor. "The man in the portrait, he's not just your father. He was the vessel before you. That's not possible." She tilted her head slightly, almost pitying me. "Possible or not, the truth doesn't care. He was chosen. He resisted, and eventually he disappeared, just as you will if you keep pretending you don't feel it." "Feel what?" "The pull, the connection, the serpent's call. It's in your blood whether you understand it yet or not." I almost laughed. It was absurd, this talk of vessels and serpents and family destinies. But under the absurdity was something else, a memory. One night, when I was a child, I'd woken up to the sound of my father whispering in the dark. Not to my mother, not to anyone visible, just to himself. His voice was rhythmic, almost chanting in a language I didn't know. When I'd asked about it in the morning, he'd brushed it off as a dream. The woman watched my face as if reading the memory from my expression. "You've seen it before. You just didn't know what you were seeing." I tightened my jaw. "Why tell me this? If I'm supposedly the next vessel, wouldn't you just let it happen?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Because I'm not here for them. I'm here for you, and I'm offering you a choice, something your father never had." The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder. She turned toward the door, her coat shifting slightly as if something heavy was hidden in one of its pockets. "If you want to live," she said, her voice low, "you'll need to leave before nightfall, but you'll never make it alone." Before I could ask anything else, she slipped out the door, her silhouette vanishing into the corridor's dim light. The metal door clicked shut behind her, not locked, but closed just enough to keep me inside. My wrists still ached from the cloth bindings, but now I worked harder, twisting against the fabric. The knot gave way with a final tug, and I rubbed my wrists quickly, listening for any return of footsteps. On the table, the notebook still lay open to the strange prophecy. I tore the page out and folded it, slipping it into my pocket. If there was any chance of understanding this, I needed to keep the words with me. I moved to the door, cracked it open, and peered into the hallway. It was narrow, lined with exposed pipes, the air damp and smelling faintly of oil. The light was worse here. Just a few old bulbs strung haphazardly along the ceiling, buzzing softly. In the distance, I heard muffled voices. One of them sounded like Constance. I followed the sound, my footsteps quiet against the concrete. The corridor sloped slightly downward, leading toward a heavier, reinforced door. The voices grew clearer. Constance's tone was panicked, pleading, while another voice, a man's, spoke in steady, measured phrases. I reached the door and pressed my ear to the cold metal. "Too soon," Constance was saying. "If she's not ready, it won't hold." "She will be ready," the man replied. I recognized the silver-haired voice instantly. "And if she's not, the blood will bind regardless." There was a pause, and then Constance whispered, "She looks like him. You know she does." I didn't need to hear more. My father wasn't just connected to this place. He was the reason I was here. And whatever this binding was, it was going to happen tonight. The realization hit me so hard, I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. My pulse pounded in my ears, and every instinct screamed at me to get out before nightfall, before they could finish whatever this binding was supposed to be. The corridor ahead curved sharply to the right. I crouched low, moving quietly, until I found a small alcove where rusted shelves held forgotten cleaning supplies. It gave me enough cover to peek out and watch the reinforced door. Minutes passed. My legs ached from crouching, but I didn't dare move. Finally, the door swung open. Constance stepped out first, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. The silver-haired man followed, his expression unreadable, his suit perfectly pressed despite the damp underground air. They headed down the opposite direction from where I hid, their footsteps fading. When I was sure they were gone, I slipped toward the door and tested the handle. Locked. I scanned the frame and spotted an old brass keyhole. My pockets were empty except for the folded prophecy page, but I remembered the storage shelves. Digging through the clutter, I found a thin wire hanger twisted nearly in half. I straightened it as best I could and knelt by the door. The metal was cold against my fingers. I'd never picked a lock in my life, but desperation makes you try things you wouldn't otherwise. It took several fumbling attempts, but then, click. The door creaked open into a large circular chamber. The smell hit me first, something sweet like rotting flowers mixed with damp stone. The floor was smooth concrete, but the walls were painted with a mural that wrapped around the entire room. The serpent from the prophecy was there, larger than life, its scales shimmering in greens and golds that seemed to shift in the dim light. Beneath it, rows of figures knelt with bowed heads. And in the center of the mural, my father's face again, painted with the same unnerving precision as the portrait. But it wasn't just a mural. At the center of the room stood a circular pit surrounded by knee-high stone walls. A faint blue light pulsed from within, casting rippling shadows on the ceiling. I stepped closer and peered inside. The pit was filled with water, so still it looked like glass. The blue light came from something deep below the surface, a smooth, egg-shaped stone, covered in carvings that looked almost alive. I froze as a ripple disturbed the water, then another. A shadow moved beneath the surface, slow and deliberate. It was too big to be a fish. My throat tightened as the shape rose, breaking the surface just enough for me to glimpse a curve of scaled skin, shiny, wet, and dark green. Then it sank back down, vanishing into the depths. The sound of a door slamming echoed down the corridor I'd come from. I backed away from the pit, scanning the chamber for another exit. That's when I saw it, a narrow archway half hidden behind the mural. The paint cracked where the frame met the wall. Footsteps approached, the measured pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry because they didn't need to be. I darted toward the archway, slipping into a narrow tunnel beyond. The air here was colder and the ceiling lower, forcing me to stoop slightly. My shoes scuffed against gravel instead of concrete. The tunnel twisted and branched. I kept to the right, my hands brushing the rough walls, until the space widened into what looked like an abandoned maintenance area. Rusted machinery lined one wall, and an old wooden desk sat in the corner, its drawers half open. I pulled one open and froze. Inside were dozens of black and white photographs, each labeled in neat handwriting. Most were of strangers, but a few made my stomach drop. There was my father, younger, in different places. A church pew, a library, a forest clearing. In every photo, he was surrounded by other people in ceremonial robes, and in the corner of one frame, Constance, looking exactly as she does now. I didn't have time to think about what that meant. The footsteps were louder now, echoing through the tunnel. I grabbed the photos and stuffed them into my coat pocket. Then I spotted a metal grate in the far wall. I knelt, tugging at it. It was loose enough to come free with a sharp pull. Beyond it, a dark, sloping passage led upward, the faintest smell of fresh air drifting down. It could be my way out. But before I could crawl through, a shadow filled the tunnel entrance. "You found it," the silver-haired man said, his voice calm, almost approving. "Just like your father." His silhouette was framed by the faint blue lights spilling from the chamber behind him. He stepped closer, and I could finally see his eyes, icy gray, unblinking. "This isn't about escape," he said softly. "It's about returning." Behind him, I heard the faint ripple of water from the pit. Something was coming. The ripple grew into a low, rhythmic slosh, like something large brushing against the sides of the pit. That cold blue glow seeped into the tunnel, pooling around the silver-haired man's shoes and casting an eerie sheen on his pale face. I could feel the air shift, denser, charged, almost humming. My fingers tightened on the edge of the grate. "Stay away from me," I said, but my voice barely carried over the soft churn of water. He tilted his head, as though studying me. "Your father said the same thing at first." It was such a simple sentence, but it landed like a punch. What do you mean, at first? My words came out faster than I wanted. He smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. He resisted. Then he understood. This family, we are threads in something older than you imagine, older than Hollow Creek, older than America. Behind him, the water surged. A shape broke the surface, long, sinuous, impossibly dark in the dim light. The air filled with the smell of brine and something metallic. Even from here, the deep, slow pull of whatever was in that pit, as though my chest was leaning toward it against my will. I gripped the grate harder. You don't have to be afraid, he said. It's not death, it's continuation. That word snapped something in me. Continuation. My father had disappeared into this thing and never come back. Continuation wasn't living. It was losing yourself, becoming part of whatever twisted legacy this was. I yanked the grate fully open and swung one leg inside the narrow shaft. He took a step forward. If you leave now, you'll never know the truth. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering. I'd rather wonder than be swallowed whole, I said. His smile didn't falter, but his voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. You think you're leaving, but the Hollow Creek line always comes back. Always. I didn't wait for more. I crawled into the shaft, my knees scraping metal, the smell of rust and dirt filling my nose. Behind me, the low splash of water quickened. I could picture the thing in the pit lifting higher, reaching for the edge. The shaft sloped upward, my hands slipping on damp stone. The incline grew steeper until I could feel cold air brushing my face. My heartbeat surged. Then, light. A faint rectangle ahead. I scrambled toward it and pushed at the rusted hatch until it gave way with a squeal. I spilled out into a thicket of dead leaves and tangled roots. Night had fallen, and the forest was drenched in moonlight. My lungs ached from the cold air, but the scent of pine and damp soil was a shock after the underground staleness. I turned back to pull the grate over the hatch again, but froze. Through the gap, far below, I could still see that faint blue glow. It pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat. And then it stopped. I didn't wait to see if it would start again. I pushed the grate shut, kicked leaves over it, and began running toward the faint glimmer of lights through the trees. The forest seemed endless, my breath clouding in front of me, branches clawing at my coat. Every crack of a twig made me flinch, convinced I'd hear footsteps behind me. Finally, I stumbled onto the gravel road that led into town. A single street lamp flickered in the distance, and I made for it like it was a lighthouse in a storm. As I reached the edge of the light, a car engine roared to life nearby. Headlights flared, momentarily blinding me. The sedan rolled forward, slowing as it approached. The window slid down. Constance sat in the passenger seat. Her expression was calm, but her eyes locked on mine in a way that froze me to the spot. "You're not done," she said, her voice soft but carrying in the cold air. The car pulled away before I could answer, disappearing into the dark road ahead. I stood there, breathing hard, the forest at my back and the glow of town just ahead. I was free, or so I told myself, but the words stuck in my head. "You're not done," and in the faint whistle of the night wind, I could almost swear I heard the sound of water lapping slowly against stone. I didn't sleep that night. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke, the kind that seeps into the wallpaper no matter how many times it's scrubbed. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling's yellow water stains, replaying every moment in the tunnels, every word the silver-haired man had said. I told myself I should call someone, police, FBI, anyone, but the idea froze in my throat. What would I say? Hi. Yes, I found a glowing pit under the home of one of America's most prestigious families, possibly housing something. I'd be a headline and a psych eval before the night was over. At around 3:15 a.m., the hum started. It wasn't loud, more like a bass note played somewhere deep beneath the earth. I pressed my palm to the thin carpet, half expecting to feel it vibrate. Nothing. But the sound was there, like it was coming from inside my own bones. By dawn, the motel's faded curtains glowed with cold light. I decided to leave town. I didn't pack much, just stuffed my things into a duffel, dropped the key on the counter, and walked out. I was halfway to my car when I saw her. Constance. She stood on the sidewalk across the street, dressed in a pale coat that made her look ghost-like in the morning haze. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. Just stood there watching me with that same calm intensity I'd seen the night before. When I blinked, she was gone. I drove. 2 hours. 3. The town shrank in my rearview mirror until it was just a memory, swallowed by highway miles. I kept expecting the hum to fade with the distance, but it didn't. It clung to me, quiet but steady, like an invisible tether pulling backward. I checked into another motel, this one 3 counties over. Different walls, different air, same insomnia. My phone buzzed around midnight. No caller ID. I shouldn't have answered. The voice was low, measured. You left something behind. Before I could respond, the line clicked dead. I stared at the phone, my hand trembling slightly. The worst part wasn't the words. It was the certainty that I recognized the voice, not from the tunnels, but from an old memory. My father's study, late at night. That same calm, patient tone speaking to him in the next room. I hadn't heard it since the week he disappeared. The hum deepened. My head swam, and for a second, I thought I smelled brine again. I set the phone down on the nightstand and lay back, telling myself that I wouldn't go back, that whatever was under Hollow Creek, whatever had swallowed my father and the others, wasn't my burden anymore. But the thing about tethers is, they don't ask permission. Somewhere in the quiet, I realized the truth. The family doesn't need me to return. They'll come to me. And when they do, the pit won't be under Hollow Creek anymore. It'll be right here. So here we are, at the end of a trail. I wish I could say I never started down. You've been with me through every cold night, every damp tunnel, every strange sound that still finds its way into my dreams. Maybe you thought the worst part would be the glowing pit, or the shape in the water, or the way Constance could stand so still that even the shadows didn't dare move. But it isn't. It's the knowing. Knowing that there are places, families, histories that never really let you go. They don't care about time or distance or whether you've convinced yourself you're safe. They exist in the gaps, in the ringing in your ears when the world is silent, in the flicker of someone you thought you saw across the street, in the taste of salt on a day when there's no ocean for miles. And the more you notice them, the more they notice you back. So tonight, before you close your eyes, think about this. How certain doors once opened can't be shut again. How some pits are deeper than they seem. And how some hums never fade no matter how far you run. Sleep well if you can. Open quote, open quote, open quote, end of story. Have a good night's sleep.